In the late 4th century, the Roman Empire still stretched across continents from the misty highlands of Britain to the golden sands of Egypt. Yet what looked like unity was in truth a fragile arrangement, a body divided against itself. One half spoke Latin, clung to old traditions, and bore the weight of constant invasions, while the other half spoke Greek, pulsed with trade and wealth, and dreamed of eternal prosperity. For centuries, civil wars, usurpers, and invading tribes had torn holes in the imperial fabric, and now one man named Constantine had gambled on a solution. He raised a new city on the Bosporus, built upon the ruins of Byzantium, and called it Constantinople. The jewel of the East, a city ringed with harbors and markets, and sanctified as a Christian capital. For a while, it worked. Constantinople became the heart of the Eastern Empire, a place rich enough to buy loyalty from its provinces, and safe enough behind the narrow straits to resist sudden invasion. Yet history is rarely kind to fragile creations. In the year 378, a storm gathered on the northern frontier, where the Goths, desperate and displaced by the iron advance of the Huns, begged Rome for shelter. The Emperor Valens allowed them across the Danube, but neglected to give them food or land or respect, and in that neglect he planted seeds of fire. The Goths, starved, abused, and extorted, rose up in fury, and the Balkans were soon ablaze. Valens, eager for glory, and fearing that his nephew Gratian would steal the honor, marched without waiting for reinforcements. His army, parched from heat and poorly scouted, met the Goths near Adrianople. The clash was catastrophic. The Roman legions were surrounded and annihilated. Cavalry thundering into flanks that were already breaking. Soldiers trapped in the sun with no water, cut down in droves. Valens himself vanished, consumed in the smoke of a burning farmhouse. Some said he died of his own hubris, others that fate itself had marked him for destruction. In our timeline, Constantinople endured this shock. It absorbed refugees, rebuilt its strength, and eventually raised the great Theodosian walls that would guard it for 1,000 years. But imagine for a moment that fortune turned differently. Imagine that the Gothic victory was not just a defeat for one emperor, but the unraveling of the entire eastern half of the empire. The city of Constantine, still young, unfortified, and trembling with fear, suddenly stood exposed to an army flushed with triumph. What if the Goths marched east, not content with burning villages, but hungry for the greatest prize of all? The road to Constantinople was short, and temptation immense. A few deserters from the city garrison whispered of its weakness, of gates without proper walls, of a population unarmed and panicked. The Goths, no longer starving, but ravenous for gold, could not ignore such a lure. So they marched, and the result was swift and merciless. Constantinople fell, not in the 15th century to Ottoman cannons, but in the 4th century to tribes armed with fury and desperation. The city was plundered, its churches stripped, its palaces burned, ancient statues toppled, manuscripts hurled into the sea. Senators, priests, and courtiers scattered into exile. The Eastern Empire, barely born, collapsed in an instant. Without Constantinople, the provinces of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt found themselves adrift, governors unsure whom to obey, troops unpaid, and supplies disrupted. In the blink of an eye, what had seemed like the stronger half of Rome fragmented into pieces. For the West, long considered the weaker branch, this disaster changed everything. Refugees poured into Italy, Gaul, and North Africa, bringing not only tales of horror, but skills, knowledge, and treasures salvaged from the ruins. The Western court suddenly held the mantle of sole Roman authority. What historians called the fall of Rome was reversed. The East was gone, and the West became the inheritor of destiny. And so begins a timeline where Rome never truly falls, where Constantinople burns in its youth, and the empire shifts its weight back to the lands of Caesar and Augustus. The question is not simply what would have happened militarily, but how religion, culture, and the very map of the ancient world would have reshaped around this single fire at the Bosporus.
When Constantinople fell, in this alternate timeline, the reverberations spread faster than any legion could march. The provinces of the East had long looked to the city as their anchor, a source of grain, trade, and imperial command. But with the jewel of the Bosphorus shattered, the entire network unraveled. Governors who once signed edicts in the name of the emperor now faced silence from above. No orders, no salaries, no reassurance that the empire still breathed. In that silence, ambition and fear bloomed like weeds. Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, watched the flames from afar and chose survival over loyalty. Alexandria, rich with scholars and merchants, severed its ties to the dead court and raised its own bishop as both spiritual and political leader. In Anatolia, ambitious generals proclaimed independence, forming fragile city-state leagues, each promising protection, yet secretly preparing to betray one another. Syria, too far from the crumbling core and too close to Persia, negotiated its own uneasy peace, trading Roman authority for Persian influence while insisting it was merely safeguarding order. Persia, of course, saw opportunity like a hawk circling a wounded prey. With Constantinople gone and the frontier collapsing, they swept into Armenia under the guise of restoring balance. In truth, they carved out territory piece by piece while pretending to honor old treaties. To the east, the empire did not fall all at once, but decayed into shards of failed states and abandoned provinces. Meanwhile, the Goths, flushed with their astonishing success, settled into the Balkans, carving out lands that, in our timeline, would later belong to Bulgars and Slavs. But here, they became the new masters, early conquerors who planted themselves on Roman soil and refused to leave. They were still divided, still tribes rather than kingdoms, yet Constantinople's fall gave them permanence. Their camps became towns, their raids turned into taxation, their chiefs fashioned themselves as rulers, not merely wanderers. The West, however, did not collapse under the weight of these disasters. Instead, it found a strange kind of rebirth. For decades, Italy, Gaul, and Hispania had lived under the shadow of decline, plagued by usurpers, mercenaries, and economic malaise. Now, suddenly, all eyes turned to them. Refugees from the East flooded into Western cities, carrying books, knowledge, artisanship, and money. The bureaucrats who once served Constantinople found employment in Ravenna or Milan. The bishops who once debated theology on the shores of the Bosphorus now sought refuge in Rome. The cultural tide shifted westward, pouring strength into provinces once written off as fading. Gratian, young and untested, became the sole emperor of a united Rome. His court at Trier gleamed with unexpected power. Though not the most charismatic ruler, he was shrewd enough to see the opportunity that history had laid at his feet. The fall of the East became a lesson carved into the memory of every senator and general. Mercenaries once trusted too much were now viewed with suspicion. Provinces once neglected were fortified. Wealth that might have flowed to Constantinople now poured into Italy and Gaul. The western provinces were not without problems. Britain still strained behind its walls. Hispania remained distant and fractious. Italy itself was vulnerable to invasion. Yet, compared to the disintegration of the East, the West seemed almost stable. Natural borders of mountains and seas offered protection. North Africa provided grain. Gaul supplied soldiers, and urban life thrived. And most importantly, the influx of Eastern refugees strengthened the administration rather than weakening it. The collapse of Constantinople also reshaped Christianity in ways difficult to overstate. In our reality, councils convened in the East, hammered out doctrine at Nicaea, Constantinople, and Chalcedon. But in this timeline, with no emperor to summon bishops eastward, all disputes flowed toward Rome. The Bishop of Rome, once a figure among several patriarchs, now became the unchallenged center of the faith. Ecumenical councils vanished, replaced by Western synods convened under papal authority. Christianity became less Greek, more Latin, less fragmented by regional councils, and more centralized under Rome. This spiritual shift reinforced the political one. The Emperor Gratian, though not a theologian, was deeply pious and hostile to pagan traditions. He refused the old title of Pontifex Maximus, cut funding to temples, and declared Christianity the heart of Roman identity. Combined with the absence of Constantinople's rival patriarch, the Bishop of Rome rose to unprecedented prominence. The West not only became the political heir of the empire, but also the spiritual core of Christianity centuries earlier than in our timeline. Thus, within a single decade, the fall of Constantinople transformed the destiny of Europe and the Mediterranean. The East fragmented to chaos, the Goths built an unexpected homeland, Persia expanded opportunistically, and the West inherited both the burdens and the glory of Rome. A single fire at the Bosphorus redirected the current of history, carrying the empire into strange waters where survival was no longer doubtful, but victory almost possible.
The strangest consequence of Constantinople's sudden fall was not just the political rearrangement, but the transformation of identity itself. For centuries, Romans had defined themselves against barbarians on their frontiers, but now the very geography of Rome changed. Without the East to balance the empire, the West began to imagine itself not as a remnant fighting for survival, but as the sole inheritor of civilization. The disaster at Adrianople became a legend, a cautionary tale told in every camp and council, reminding Romans of the cost of arrogance and neglect. Gratian, who in our timeline struggled for legitimacy, now found himself elevated by necessity. He was the only emperor, and his authority no longer shared with colleagues across the Bosporus. The court at Trier became a magnet for talent. Eastern administrators skilled in taxation, logistics, and diplomacy arrived in waves. Their experience gave new strength to the Western state, and their presence reminded everyone that Rome was now one, not two. The military, too, began to change. The West had long relied on Germanic auxiliaries and mercenaries, but the sight of Gothic horsemen burning Constantinople seared a lesson into the imperial mind. Gratian and his advisors began reforming the army, favoring recruitment of Roman citizens from Gaul, Hispania, and Italy. They invested in fortifications along the Rhine and Danube, determined not to repeat the complacency of the East. Training camps multiplied, arsenals expanded, and though the empire still used barbarian soldiers, it did so with far tighter oversight and harsher discipline. In this alternate history, the Goths did not march westward to sack Rome in the 5th century, because they had already found a homeland in the east. Their energy was spent consolidating Balkan territory and resisting rival tribes, such as Vandals and Huns. This gave the Western Empire crucial breathing space. For once, the calamities that crushed the West in our history were deflected eastward. The barbarians who might have toppled Rome instead hammered away at the fractured remains of Anatolia and Thrace. Religious authority, meanwhile, became an even more powerful glue binding the West together. The Bishop of Rome, now undisputed in rank, began to convene councils that declared heresies and set doctrine. Theological debates that, in our timeline, played out across Eastern cities were now centered in Italy, Gaul, and North Africa. When disputes arose between Arians and Nicenes, between those who claimed Christ had one nature and those who claimed two, the deciding voice was Roman, not Byzantine. This created a church more unified, but also more Romanized. Latin replaced Greek as the language of theology, far earlier than in our timeline, and the papal authority began to eclipse even that of the emperor. The cultural impact was immense. Refugees from Constantinople brought libraries, manuscripts, and artistic traditions westward. Cities like Milan, Ravenna, and even Carthage became unexpected centers of learning. The architectural techniques planned for Constantinople were adapted for basilicas in Italy and Gaul. The West, which in our history entered decline, instead experienced a renaissance of sorts, fueled by Eastern knowledge and wealth. This influx blurred the line between Old Rome and New, making the Western Empire feel less like the tired air of Augustus and more like a rejuvenated power. Of course, not all was secure. The provinces remained restless. Britain's legions were thin. Hispania often acted with independence. North Africa, though vital for grain supply, was prone to unrest. Yet compared to the disintegration of the East, these problems felt manageable. The empire could still field armies, levy taxes, and build roads. Its capital, though shifting between Trier, Milan, and Ravenna, still commanded respect. Its senators, though corrupt, were cautious enough to recognize that survival required unity. Persia's shadow loomed large in this era. With the East in ruins, the Sassanids expanded influence steadily, but they faced their own limits. Their golden ruler, Shapur II, soon died, leaving successors less capable and internal strife weakening their push westward. For decades, they chipped away at Armenia and Mesopotamia, but never launched a decisive invasion of the West. Thus, Rome, though diminished in territory, retained the prestige of being the only true empire in the Mediterranean. The Goths, meanwhile, settled into a role eerily similar to the Bulgars of our reality, carving out a lasting kingdom in the Balkans. They raided occasionally and clashed with neighbors, but they lacked the power to challenge the West directly. Instead, they served as an unintended shield, absorbing the first waves of Hunnic expansion. When Attila's predecessors advanced from the steppes, they collided with Gothic tribes entrenched in Thrace, sparing the western provinces from immediate devastation. So, in this alternate history, the collapse of the East paradoxically extended the life of the West. It forced Rome to reform earlier. It gave the papacy unmatched authority. It redirected barbarian pressure away from Italy. And it poured resources and knowledge into Western provinces that, in our timeline, slowly decayed. The fire of Constantinople did not extinguish Rome. It purified it by burning away the rival half and leaving a leaner, stronger empire.
As decades passed after the fall of Constantinople, the Western Roman Empire entered a phase unlike anything seen in our timeline. The collapse of the East had been a shock, a wound so deep that many thought Rome itself would perish, yet the opposite occurred. Freed from rivalry and compelled to adapt, the West began to weave a new fabric of stability, one stitched together by necessity, faith, and the memory of catastrophe. Gratian's reign, though short in our history, became in this alternate world the foundation of renewal. He embraced the authority that fate thrust upon him, but he was wise enough to recognize his own limits. He surrounded himself with capable administrators drawn from both West and East, men who had fled the wreckage of Constantinople and now sought to preserve Roman greatness. They brought with them techniques of taxation, new methods of organizing supply chains, and above all, an awareness of the mistakes that had doomed the East. Their message was simple. Never allow mercenaries to hold the empire hostage. Never allow arrogance to blind an emperor to reality. The military reforms began to bear fruit by the early 5th century. Training camps along the Rhine produced legions disciplined enough to resist incursions. Fortifications along the Danube slowed the movements of raiders. The Western army was still stretched thin, yet unlike the chaotic forces of our reality, it retained cohesion. In Gaul, soldiers drawn from Romanized communities fought not only for pay but for identity, seeing themselves as guardians of the empire's survival. Hispania, long distant and rebellious, now supplied officers eager for prestige. Italy, still the symbolic heart, pulsed with wealth redirected from lost eastern provinces. Religion, meanwhile, solidified as the cornerstone of unity. The Bishop of Rome, now undisputed in authority, worked hand in hand with emperors to craft an identity that was both Roman and Christian. Paganism, once a tolerated tradition, was steadily stripped of its privileges. Temples were converted into churches, festivals rededicated to saints. The people came to believe not only in Rome as eternal, but in Rome as chosen by God. The absence of an Eastern patriarch meant that disputes flowed westward, and the Pope became the final arbiter. This did not eliminate conflict, heresies still spread, and rival bishops still argued, but the weight of Rome's authority gave the faith a cohesion that the fractured East could not replicate. Culturally, the empire experienced an unlikely flourishing. Refugees carried scrolls from Constantinople into libraries at Milan and Carthage. Scholars displaced from Alexandria sought new patrons in Ravenna. Artists sculpted mosaics that blended Eastern style with Western tradition. What could have been a dark age became instead a reconfiguration. Knowledge did not vanish into monasteries alone, it circulated through urban centers that still thrived under imperial patronage. Western cities, though smaller than their Eastern counterparts, retained vitality. Markets bustled, roads remained open, aqueducts were repaired, and schools taught both classical texts and Christian scripture. The geopolitical map around Rome also shifted dramatically. Persia occupied Armenia and parts of Mesopotamia, but their reach stalled at the edges of Anatolia, where Gothic tribes entrenched themselves. The Goths, now firmly settled in the Balkans, served as a buffer between Rome and the steppe peoples. Beyond them, the Huns gathered strength, but every clash they fought with the Goths delayed their advance deeper into Roman territory. Unlike our timeline, where Attila marched into the heart of Europe, here his predecessors faced resistance earlier and more consistently. This delay gave the Western Empire time to build fortifications, time to reform its armies, time to cultivate loyalty among provinces. By the time the Huns became a formidable threat, the West was less fragile and more resilient. It could muster armies that were not cobbled together at the last moment, but sustained by decades of reform. It could call upon bishops to rally popular support, declaring defense of the empire as defense of the faith. It could even leverage alliances with Franks and Alemanni tribes who were managed more carefully than in our reality, kept in check by both force and diplomacy. In our timeline, the 5th century spelled doom for the West, as barbarian invasions fractured Gaul, Spain, and Italy. But in this alternate history, the tide ran differently. With the East gone, Rome could no longer afford complacency, and so it acted decisively. The empire still faced rebellions, usurpers, and economic strain, but it endured far better than history recorded. And with each passing decade, the idea grew stronger that the West was not merely surviving, but destined to endure. That the flames of Constantinople had purified the empire, leaving behind a core of iron. The cultural consequences stretched far beyond politics. Without Eastern councils to dominate theology, Christianity evolved differently in this world. Instead of fierce rivalries between Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch, Rome's authority remained unchallenged. This meant fewer great schisms in the short term, but also a more centralized, rigid church. The Pope became the natural leader of Christendom centuries earlier, and the bond between empire and church hardened into steel. Religion ceased to be one pillar among many, it became the very foundation of Roman identity. Thus, by the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire, though battered by challenges, stood tall against storms that in our world shattered it. The East had collapsed like a house of sand, yet from its ashes the West learned strength. It is a paradox of history that sometimes the loss of a limb can save the body, and in this alternate world, Rome discovered that survival demanded sacrifice. Constantinople burned, and in its burning, the eternal city found new life.
When people think of the fall of an empire, they often picture cities sacked, armies shattered, and emperors dragged from their thrones. But the truth is that the death of Rome in our timeline was also the death of an idea, the belief that empire could last forever. In this alternate world where Constantinople burned in 378, that idea never died. Instead, it adapted, hardened, and spread westward like a flame carried by refugees and priests. By the late 5th century, the Western Empire looked nothing like the fragile state of our reality. Its borders were narrower, its wealth uneven, its enemies restless. Yet it was alive, more alive than history ever allowed it to be. Cities like Ravenna, Milan, Carthage, and Trier grew as centers of administration and culture. Rome itself, though no longer the permanent capital, retained its symbolic weight, a city of monuments, churches, and memory. Refugees from the East continued to reshape the West, bringing with them libraries, treasures, and a sense of mission. They told stories of what had been lost in the flames, manuscripts burned, statues melted, councils abandoned. Their presence reminded the West that weakness had a cost, and that cost was annihilation. The papacy had risen to heights unimaginable in our history. By now, the Pope was not merely Bishop of Rome, but the voice of Christianity itself. No rival patriarch in Constantinople, no ecumenical councils convened by Eastern emperors, no competing centers of authority. When disputes arose in Africa, in Gaul, or even in distant Britain, the answer came from Rome. This gave the faith a unity it never truly had in our world. Theological debates still raged. Arians and Nicenes still argued, yet decisions carried the authority of both empire and church, intertwined in a way that bound citizens more tightly to Rome. The military reforms begun after Adrianople also continued to bear fruit. Garrisons along the Rhine grew stronger. Franks and Alemanni were not allowed to swell unchecked within the empire. Instead, they were managed through calculated alliances and harsh discipline. The legions were smaller than those of Augustus, yet they were loyal and more Romanized than the mercenary armies that doomed the East. The Huns, when they finally pressed westward, found resistance not from a fractured empire, but one hardened by decades of preparation. Their raids were fierce, their cavalry terrifying, but the buffer of Gothic tribes in the Balkans absorbed much of their fury. The West faced incursions, but it did not face collapse. Economically, the empire remained challenged, yet more stable than in reality. Grain from Africa and Sicily kept cities alive. Trade with Gaul and Hispania circulated coinage. The influx of Eastern wealth filled treasuries long thought empty. Even corruption, though still present, was tempered by fear of collapse. Senators remembered the fate of Constantinople and knew that decadence left unchecked could destroy everything. The imperial bureaucracy, though heavy with refugees, functioned with surprising efficiency. Culturally, this alternate Rome shaped Europe in ways far beyond survival. Without Constantinople as a beacon, Greek influence diminished faster. Latin became the language not only of law, but of theology, scholarship, and philosophy. Manuscripts saved from the East blended with Western traditions to create a culture more unified and more Romanized than ever before. Art and architecture bore the marks of Eastern style, yet flourished in Western cities. Basilicas rose where temples once stood. Mosaics glimmered with both Christian and classical imagery. Education remained intact, not as a privilege of scattered monasteries, but as a civic responsibility, supported by emperors and bishops alike. Looking beyond Rome, the Mediterranean world shifted as well. Persia held territories in the east, but without Constantinople as a counterweight, they faced no united Christian front. Their influence waxed and waned, yet they never achieved dominance. Egypt carved its own path, occasionally rejoining Rome when politics allowed, at other times drifting into independence. Yet the heart of empire remained firmly Western. The balance of power that in our history tilted eastward toward Byzantium here stayed in Italy, Gaul, and North Africa. So what is the legacy of this world? In our reality, Rome fractured into countless kingdoms, its language splintered, its culture absorbed into medieval fragments. But in this alternate history, the West endured longer, unified under emperors and popes. The empire never regained the boundless horizons of Augustus, but it never collapsed into oblivion either. Instead, it stabilized as a more compact realm, still Roman in law, language, and faith, still powerful enough to shape the destiny of Europe for centuries. The irony is inescapable. The city built to save Rome became the city that doomed it. By razing Constantinople, Constantine had shifted the center of gravity to the east. But in this alternate history, the fire of 378 destroyed that gamble before it could succeed. And in that destruction, the West was reborn. What seemed like catastrophe became salvation. What looked like the end of empire became the start of its renewal. History often turns on the narrowest hinges. A single battle, a single march, a single decision to wait for reinforcements or to attack without them. Valens chose wrongly, the Goths struck decisively, and in this world, Constantinople fell. The course of civilization bent in a new direction. Rome survived, not as a divided empire limping toward collapse, but as a united West, scarred yet enduring. Eternal in a way that perhaps even Augustus could never have imagined.